The bulldozers roared as they cleared the last patch of land, making way for yet another row of identical cookie-cutter homes. The HOA president, Gerald Whitmore, stood proudly at the edge of the freshly paved road, admiring what he believed was his greatest achievement yet. 96 homes, built from the ground up, ready to be sold to wealthy families looking for a peaceful, upscale neighborhood. Everything was perfect until it wasn't. That morning, a group of men in suits walked onto the development site. They weren't from the HOA. They weren't home buyers. They carried briefcases, and their expressions were stone cold. The leader, a man in his 60s with piercing blue eyes, stepped forward and unfolded a piece of paper. "You've built on my land," the man said, his voice calm but firm. Gerald laughed, brushing him off. "That's impossible. We've owned this land for 2 years. We have the papers to prove it." The man didn't laugh. He simply handed over the document in his hand. Gerald's face turned pale as he read the words. The truth hit him like a train. This man, this nobody, this stranger, owned every single inch of the land beneath their feet. The entire neighborhood. Every house. Every street. Everything. How is this possible?" Gerald stammered. The man smiled. "You walked right into my trap." 6 years earlier, the land was nothing but an abandoned stretch of woods and dirt roads on the outskirts of town. No one paid attention to it. No one wanted it. Developers ignored it, thinking it wasn't worth the effort. The land was overgrown, swampy in places, and looked completely useless. But one man saw potential where no one else did. His name was Walter Grayson. Walter was no ordinary man. He was quiet, unassuming, but dangerously intelligent. He had spent his life studying loopholes, legal tricks, and the weaknesses of powerful people. He knew that in a world run by corporations and greedy investors, the smartest person wasn't the one with the most money. It was the one who could see what others missed. One day, while going through old county records, Walter found something interesting. A legal error buried in paperwork from decades ago. It showed that the land, this forgotten, ignored piece of land, was still tied up in old ownership contracts that had never been properly transferred. No one had a clear title to it. The records were a mess. Walter saw his opportunity. He spent months, quietly, carefully, buying up every loose claim to the land. He contacted old families who had long forgotten they even had rights to it. He offered them small sums, just enough for them to happily sign over their shares. Piece by piece, he built an unshakable legal claim. And then he waited. Years passed. Developers started taking notice of the land. The town grew, expanding toward the area. Big investors began eyeing it. And soon enough, the HOA stepped in, convinced they had secured the land fair and square. Walter watched as they bulldozed the trees. He watched as they laid the foundations. He watched as they built homes, paved roads, and put up street signs. He watched them spend millions, all while thinking they owned it. And he never said a word. Until today. Gerald's hands shook as he flipped through the document. His legal team, standing behind him, frantically whispered to each other, scanning the pages. But there was no way out. Walter had played the long game. "What do you want?" Gerald finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Walter smiled again. "You'll find out soon enough." Before all of this, before the trap had fully been set, Walter had lived a simple life. He had a small house on the edge of town, a love for old books, and a mind sharper than most people ever realized. He had spent years watching as people like Gerald and his HOA friends took what wasn't theirs, bending rules to their advantage, pushing out small families for the sake of profit. He had seen neighborhoods transformed into soulless, overpriced communities, all in the name of progress. He had watched them ruin people's lives, forcing them out of homes they had lived in for generations. And he had made a decision. If the powerful want to play dirty, he would play smarter. He spent years learning the law better than they did. He found the cracks in their system. And when the moment was right, he set the perfect trap, one they never even saw coming. And now, standing in front of Gerald Whitmore, watching the realization dawn on him that everything he thought he owned wasn't his at all, Walter felt the first taste of victory. But this was just the beginning, because what happened next would shake the entire town to its core. That night, after the shocking revelation, the HOA board gathered in a private meeting. Gerald, still pale, slammed his fist on the table. "We need to fix this. There has to be a way out." The lawyers shuffled through papers, but their faces told the truth before they even spoke. "There's nothing we can do," one finally admitted. "Walter Grayson owns the land, and unless he's willing to sell it back, every home built here is on property that isn't legally ours." Gerald clenched his teeth. "Then we make him sell." But Walter wasn't a man who could be pressured, and when they tried to force his hand, they realized they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. Because Walter Grayson wasn't just smart. He was 3 steps ahead of them, and their nightmare was only just beginning. Gerald Whitmore was a man used to being in control. He had spent years bullying homeowners into following the HOA's strict rules. No unapproved fences, no loud music after 7 p.m., no unsanctioned holiday decorations. He had fined elderly couples into submission, forced young families to repaint their homes over minor violations, and even driven people out when they couldn't keep up with the ever-changing fees. But now, for the first time in his life, he was the one with no power, and he hated it. That night, after the emergency HOA board meeting, Gerald drove straight to Walter Grayson's house. It was an old, modest home on the edge of town, surrounded by thick trees. No fancy gates, no flashy cars. Just a small porch, dimly lit by a single yellow bulb. Walter was already waiting for him, sitting in a rocking chair, sipping a glass of iced tea. "You've got some nerve," Gerald growled as he stepped onto the porch. Walter didn't even flinch. He simply gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Have a seat." "I'd rather stand." Walter shrugged. "Suit yourself." He took another slow sip of tea, letting the silence stretch. Gerald felt his pulse pounding in his temples. "We need to talk," Gerald finally said. "We are talking." Gerald clenched his fists. "How much do you want?" Walter raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "The land," Gerald snapped. "You've made your point. You outsmarted us. Congratulations. Now, let's be adults about this. Name your price, and we'll pay it. That way, this can all go away." Walter chuckled. "You think I did all this for money?" Gerald's stomach twisted. He had been sure this was about money. It was always about money. But the way Walter smiled, calm, knowing, amused, made him uneasy. "If it's not money, then what do you want?" Gerald asked through gritted teeth. Walter leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I want you to understand something, Gerald. For years, you and your HOA buddies have pushed people around. You've taken what isn't yours, bled homeowners dry with fees, made their lives miserable over the pettiest things. You've ruined people." Gerald scoffed. "This is about revenge? You're holding an entire neighborhood hostage over some old grudge." Walter tilted his head. "Not a grudge. A lesson." Gerald's patience snapped. "Listen to me, you old fool. If you don't sell us that land, we'll bury you in lawsuits. You think you're clever, but we have money, power, connections. You won't win this." Walter didn't blink. Instead, he pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Gerald. Gerald hesitated, then snatched it up and unfolded it, and his blood ran cold. It was a cease and desist order. From Walter, against the HOA. The document made it clear every home in the new neighborhood was illegally occupying his land. And as the lawful owner, Walter had every right to evict every single person living there. Every single one. "You wouldn't dare," Gerald whispered. Walter just smiled. "Would not." The next morning, the homeowners woke up to chaos. Every mailbox had a letter inside, an official notice of eviction. The paper stated that all 96 homes had been built on land they didn't legally own. If the homeowners didn't vacate within 30 days, they would be removed by force. Panic spread like wildfire. Families rushed out of their houses, reading the letters in disbelief. Some cried. Some screamed. Others stormed over to the HOA office, demanding answers. Gerald sat in his office, drenched in sweat. His phone rang nonstop. Furious homeowners. Reporters. Lawyers. It was an absolute nightmare. That afternoon, an emergency town hall meeting was held in the local gymnasium. The place was packed. Furious homeowners filled the bleachers, their voices a roaring storm. Gerald stood at the front, flanked by his legal team. He raised his hands for silence, but the shouts continued. "This has to be a mistake," one man yelled. "I was bought my house last month. What am I supposed to do?" a woman sobbed. "You lied to us," another man bellowed. "We paid everything we had for these homes." Gerald swallowed hard. Listen. We are working on a solution. This is just a misunderstanding. We'll fight this in court." A harsh laugh echoed through the gym. Walter Grayson stepped into view. The room fell dead silent. Walter walked slowly to the front, hands in his pockets, eyes calm. He looked around at the panicked homeowners, the desperate faces, the fear in their eyes. Then he turned to Gerald. "Tell them the truth," Walter said. Gerald clenched his jaw. "I don't know what you're talking about." Walter pulled out another document. He held it up. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walter said, his voice steady, "let me explain what happened. Your HOA built your homes on land they never legally owned. They thought they could get away with it. They thought no one would notice." The crowd erupted again. People shouted, cursed, some even lunged forward in rage. Walter raised a hand, and shockingly, the room quieted down. His presence carried weight. "I own this land," he continued. "And legally, that means I have every right to remove all of you." A woman in the front, clutching a baby, sobbed, "Please, we have nowhere to go." Walter sighed. "I don't want to throw anyone out of their homes, but I will teach your HOA a lesson they'll never forget." Gerald's stomach twisted. "What are you going to do?" Walter folded his arms. "You'll see soon enough." That night, a storm rolled in. Gerald sat alone in his office, staring at his computer screen. His lawyers had scoured every legal angle, but the truth was undeniable. Walter owned the land. There was no way around it. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. A text. "Unknown number. You should check the news." His heart pounded as he clicked open his laptop and searched for the latest updates. A live news report was playing. He clicked on it. The camera showed a bulldozer rolling onto the edge of the neighborhood. Walter Grayson stood beside it, calm as ever. The reporter's voice was shaky. "We're live at the scene where Walter Grayson, the rightful owner of this land, has just announced that if the HOA refuses to cooperate." The camera zoomed in. Walter was holding a demolition order. He will begin tearing down every single house built illegally on his land. Gerald's breath caught in his throat. The reporter turned to Walter. "Mr. Grayson, are you really going to do this?" Walter looked straight into the camera. "If the HOA doesn't meet my demands by tomorrow morning," he said, "then yes." He placed a hand on the bulldozer. "We start demolition at sunrise." The entire town woke up to the news. Walter Grayson wasn't bluffing. By sunrise, 3 more bulldozers had arrived, parked ominously at the entrance of the neighborhood. Armed with legal documents and an ironclad claim, Walter was ready to erase every single home the HOA had built on his land. Homeowners flooded the streets, clutching their phones, watching the news, making desperate calls to lawyers, the mayor, anyone who could stop this madness. Parents held crying children, elderly couples stood in shock, and families who had spent their life savings on these homes realized they were about to lose everything. But the bulldozers didn't move. Not yet. Walter was waiting for Gerald Whitmore to bend the knee. Gerald sat in the HOA office, feeling like a caged animal. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. The mayor, the town council, even state officials were demanding to know how he had let this happen. He had no answers. The HOA's lawyers had been up all night looking for a loophole, but there was none. Walter had outplayed them in every possible way. And now, with 96 homes hanging in the balance, Gerald had to do something. "Call Walter," he barked at his assistant. "Get him here. Now." 30 minutes later, Walter arrived at the HOA office. He didn't rush. He didn't look nervous. He strolled in as if he owned the place, because he did. Gerald was waiting for him, hands flat on the table, his face red with stress. "Enough games," Gerald snapped. "What do you want?" Walter took his time, sitting down. He looked around the fancy office, the expensive furniture, the plaques on the wall. Then he smiled. "I want to hear you say it," Walter said. Gerald clenched his jaw. "Say what?" Walter leaned forward. "Say that you built on land you didn't own. Say that your greed blinded you. say that you've been scamming people for years, charging them outrageous HOA fees, making their lives miserable, and now you're paying for it. Gerald's fists clenched. His entire body burned with humiliation. He was Gerald Whitmore. He didn't beg. He didn't lose. But if he didn't do this, 96 families would lose their homes. His breathing was shaky. He felt trapped because he was. Finally, through gritted teeth, he said the words. We built on land we didn't own. Walter's eyes twinkled, and Gerald swallowed hard. His pride tasted like acid in his throat. And I was greedy. Walter nodded. Good. Now we can talk. Outside, the tension was unbearable. The homeowners had gathered, watching the office door, waiting for news. Would it be saved? Or would the bulldozers start rolling? After what felt like hours, the door finally opened. Walter stepped out first. Gerald followed, looking like a man who had just been broken. Walter raised his voice so everyone could hear. I made a deal. Silence fell over the crowd. Gerald's voice was hoarse. The HOA no longer owns this neighborhood. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People turned to one another, whispering in shock. Walter took over. As of today, I am the sole owner of this land and everything on it. Someone in the crowd shouted, What does that mean for us? Walter looked out over the sea of faces. The young families, the retirees, the single parents who had scraped together everything to live here. He let the moment stretch. Then he said the words that changed everything. It means you're free. The next day, Gerald Whitmore was gone. His office was cleared out. His nameplate removed. The man who had ruled over homeowners with an iron fist had been dethroned. Walter had given him a choice, either resign and disappear or watch the neighborhood be demolished. Gerald chose to leave, and for the first time, the HOA no longer had power over the people. No more ridiculous fines. No more petty rules. No more living in fear. The homeowners celebrated, hugging one another, crying tears of relief. But Walter wasn't done yet, because now that he owned the neighborhood, he had one last surprise. That night, he sent out a letter to every homeowner, and when they opened it, they couldn't believe their eyes. Gerald, now sitting in a cheap motel outside of town, stared at his phone in disbelief. He had just received a text from one of his old HOA board members. A picture of Walter's letter, and the words that made his heart stop. Walter Grayson just wiped out every HOA fee. Forever. The HOA was dead. And Walter? Walter had won. For the first time in years, the homeowners of Willow Creek, formerly under the rule of Gerald Whitmore's HOA, woke up free. No more arbitrary fines. No more threats over grass being an inch too tall. No more ridiculous rules dictating the color of their front doors. The neighborhood belonged to them now. But as the morning sun painted the sky golden, a different kind of realization began to sink in. Walter Grayson may have freed them from the HOA, but he still owned every single inch of their land. The first sign that things weren't over came at exactly 10 a.m. A knock on the door. A man named Tom Reynolds, a father of 3 who had spent every dime he had on his house, opened the door to find a delivery man standing there with an envelope. Confused, he took it. The letter inside was simple. As the legal owner of this land, I am enacting a new neighborhood policy. Every homeowner now has 2 options. Purchase the land beneath your home from me at a fair price and own your property outright. Pay me a monthly land lease to remain here. You have 30 days to decide. Sincerely, Walter Grayson, ***. Tom's stomach dropped. Walter wasn't finished. Within hours, panic spread across the neighborhood. People ran outside, holding identical letters in their hands. Some were furious, waving the paper in the air and shouting to their neighbors. Others stood in stunned silence, rereading the words over and over. What the hell is this? One man yelled. We thought he saved us. He owns the land, a woman muttered. Of course, he was going to pull something like this. A group of homeowners gathered in the park, debating their options. He's giving us a chance to buy the land. That's fair, isn't it? One man reasoned. With what money? Another snapped. I already spent everything I had buying this damn house. Now I have to buy the land too. And then there was the other problem, the people who couldn't afford to buy. If they couldn't come up with the money, They would have to pay rent on the land beneath their own homes. Walter had freed them from the HOA, but now he was their landlord. That evening, the neighborhood demanded a meeting with Walter. This time, the gymnasium wasn't just packed, it was explosive. Walter sat calmly at the front, hands folded on the table, as angry homeowners shouted at him. "This is extortion. You tricked us. You're no better than the HOA." Walter didn't react. He let them rage, let them scream. He had expected this. Finally, when the crowd started to settle, he spoke. "I didn't trick anyone," he said simply. "I freed you from the HOA. Now, I'm giving you a choice." People muttered angrily, but they listened. "If you want full ownership of your home, buy the land from me," Walter continued. "And before you accuse me of being unfair, let me remind you, I could have sold this land to developers for millions. But I didn't. I'm offering you the first chance." Someone in the back shouted, "And what if we can't afford it?" Walter leaned forward. "Then you can rent the land. It'll be cheaper than what the HOA was charging you in fees." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some people started nodding. They hated the idea of paying rent, but Walter was right. The HOA had been bleeding them dry for years. At least with Walter, they knew exactly who they were dealing with. But one man wasn't convinced. Tom Reynolds. He stepped forward, gripping the letter in his hand. "You say this is fair, but you knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you?" His voice was steady, but filled with quiet anger. "You let the HOA build on your land. You let us move in. And now, you're holding that over our heads." Walter didn't deny it. Tom shook his head. "This was your plan all along, wasn't it?" The room went silent. All eyes were on Walter. And then he smiled. "Yes, it was." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Tom took a step closer. "Why? Why go through all this?" Walter's expression hardened. "Because for years, people like Gerald and his HOA have gotten away with this kind of thing. Taking what isn't theirs. Bullying homeowners. Making up rules that only serve to fatten their own pockets." He looked out over the crowd. They got caught. And now, I'm making sure they never do it again. The tension in the room was thick. People exchanged glances. They had hated Gerald. They had wanted the HOA gone. But Walter? Walter had taken control. That night, Tom sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letter. His wife, Sarah, sat across from him, their kids asleep in the next room. "We can't afford to buy the land," she whispered. "Not right now." Tom ran a hand through his hair. "I know. We'll have to rent it." He clenched his jaw. He hated the idea of paying Walter every month for the land beneath his own feet. But what choice did they have? Sarah hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at both of them. "Do you think Walter's really better than the HOA?" Tom didn't answer, because deep down, he wasn't sure. The next morning, Gerald Whitmore was back. He had been humiliated, banished, forced to flee town like a coward. But he wasn't done yet. Standing outside his motel, he made a call. When the person on the other end answered, Gerald spoke in a low, dangerous voice. "I need a lawyer. A damn good one." He took a breath. "Because I'm taking Walter Grayson down." Gerald Whitmore had spent the last week licking his wounds in a dingy motel. But now, the fire inside him was raging. Walter Grayson had humiliated him, took his power, destroyed everything he built. And worst of all, he had done it so easily. But Gerald wasn't the kind of man to stay beaten. No, he was going to get his revenge, and this time, he would make sure Walter lost everything. Meanwhile, in Willow Creek, the deadline was Walter had given every homeowner 30 days to decide, buy the land or pay rent. And as the days ticked by, tensions ran high. Some people had already started scraping together money to buy their land, relieved to finally own everything outright. Others were furious, feeling tricked, betrayed, as if they had swapped one master for another. Tom Reynolds, the unofficial voice of the people, was one of the angriest. He had organized a meeting at his house, inviting every frustrated homeowner. By the time the sun set, his living room was packed. "We can't let Walter dictate our lives," Tom said, pacing the room. "He's backed us into a corner. Either we pay him thousands of dollars, or we're stuck renting the land forever." A woman named Linda Evans, a retired teacher, crossed her arms. "But what choice do we have? At least he isn't running a corrupt HOA. That's better than before, right? That's not the point, Tom snapped. This is still about control. First, it was Gerald. Now it's Walter. We're always at someone's mercy. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Tom took a deep breath. We need to fight back. Silence. Then someone in the back scoffed. And do what, exactly? A man muttered. Walter owns this land legally. You want to sue him? You think you'll win? Tom's hands curled into fists. No, they couldn't win in court. Walter had played his game perfectly. But maybe there was another way. The next morning, Tom paid Walter a visit. Walter was sitting on his porch, sipping tea like he didn't have a care in the world. He didn't even look surprised when Tom arrived. Morning, Walter said casually. I assume you're here to make me an offer? Tom's jaw clenched, more like a demand. Walter chuckled. Go on then. Tom sat down across from him. I want you to turn Willow Creek into a co-op. Walter raised an eyebrow. A co-op? Tom leaned forward. The neighborhood pools its money together, buys the land collectively. No landlords. No HOA. We, the people, own everything. Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then he smirked. I like it. Tom blinked, caught off guard. You do. Walter nodded. It's a smart idea. Gives the power back to the people. It's exactly the kind of thing I wanted. Tom's chest swelled with hope. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. But then, Walter's expression turned calculating. Of course, he said slowly, there's one problem. Tom felt his stomach drop. What? Walter leaned back. You'd need millions to buy the land at fair market value. You don't have that kind of money. Tom's hope shattered. Walter sighed. I could sell you the land at a discount, but I'm not giving away for free. That would be bad business. Tom gritted his teeth. So we're just supposed to accept this? Walter shrugged. You're free to figure out another way. I'm not stopping you. Tom stood up, fist clenched. Walter didn't need to stop them, because he had already won. Back at the motel, Gerald was plotting. He had found a lawyer, a dangerous one, a man named Raymond Holt, who specialized in land disputes and legal warfare. As Gerald laid out everything that had happened, Raymond leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin. You're right about one thing, Raymond finally said. Walter played this perfectly, but he isn't invincible. Gerald's eyes gleamed. You have something? Raymond smirked. I might, but it's not going to be clean. If we go after him, it's going to get ugly. Gerald smiled for the first time in weeks. Perfect. A week later, Walter received a letter. It was from Raymond Holt's law office. And the moment he read it, his jaw tightened. Because Gerald wasn't trying to fight him in court. No, Gerald was playing dirty. He had just launched a full-blown smear campaign. By the next morning, news stations were running the story. Local man tricks homeowners into paying him rent after destroying their HOA. Reporters called Walter a con man, a manipulator, a land thief. People outside of Willow Creek, who didn't know the full story, started demonizing him. And then, the mayor got involved. By noon, Walter got a call from City Hall. We need to talk, the mayor said. Walter knew what was coming. The town was going to turn against him. And suddenly, the man who had set the perfect trap was about to walk right into one of his own. Walter sat in his office. The letter from the mayor spread out on his desk. It was official. The city council was stepping in. The media had taken Gerald's story and run with it, twisting the facts, painting Walter as a villain, a greedy landowner who had tricked innocent homeowners into paying him rent. They called him worse than the HOA. And now, the mayor wanted a meeting. Walter leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had expected pushback. He had expected the homeowners to be frustrated. But this was Gerald's revenge. And Walter had to be very careful about his next move. The meeting was held in City Hall behind closed doors. Walter sat across from Mayor Bethany Carter, a sharp-eyed woman who had been in office for 10 years. She had a reputation for being fair but ruthless, and right now, she did not look happy. She folded her hands on the table. You've put me in a difficult position, Mr. Grayson. Walter tilted his head. Have I? The mayor slid a folder across the table. Inside were dozens of complaints from Willow Creek residents. I don't know what your plan was, she continued, but the people of this town are scared. They thought you were a hero. Now, they think you're holding their homes hostage. Walter nodded slowly. And what do you think, Mayor? Bethany studied him. I think you're smarter than Gerald ever was. And I think you're playing a long game I don't fully understand yet. Walter smirked. You're right. The mayor sighed. Walter, let me be clear. If this situation doesn't resolve peacefully, the city will step in. And trust me, you don't want that. Walter leaned forward. Are you threatening me, Mayor? Bethany didn't blink. I'm warning you. For the first time in years, Walter felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pressure. Gerald's plan was working. Walter had set a trap for the HOA, but Gerald had set one for him. Back in Willow Creek, the tension had reached a boiling point. A group of angry homeowners, led by Tom Reynolds, marched to Walter's property, demanding a public meeting. They weren't just frustrated anymore. They were furious. We want answers, Tom shouted. You can't just own the ground under our feet and expect us to accept it. Walter stood on his porch, watching the crowd gather. And then he made a decision. He stepped forward and raised his hands. All right, he called out. You want answers? Let's talk. The crowd packed into the neighborhood park, where Walter stood on a raised platform. People yelled. Some waved the letters he had sent. This isn't what we agreed to, one woman shouted. You tricked us, another man snapped. Walter let them rage for a full 5 minutes. Then, when the voices finally started to die down, he spoke. I never lied to you, he said. I gave you exactly what you wanted. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I took down the HOA. Walter continued. I freed you from Gerald Whitmore and his ridiculous rules. I didn't have to do that. I could have sold this land to a developer before you ever moved in. But I didn't. Someone scoffed. And now you're our landlord instead? Walter smiled. No, he said. I'm giving you a choice. A choice no one has ever given you before. The crowd fell silent. Walter's voice hardened. You can own your land. I'm selling it to you at a price far lower than market value. You'll never have to answer to another HOA again. You'll never be forced to pay a dime to anyone you don't want to. A few people nodded, but Tom wasn't convinced. And if we can't afford it, he demanded. Walter sighed. Then you can lease it, at half the cost of what you paid in HOA fees. The crowd stirred. Walter saw doubt flicker in some eyes. Because the truth was, even renting from him was cheaper than the nightmare they had lived under Gerald's HOA. Walter spread his hands. You want a freedom, he said. I'm offering it to you. Tom folded his arms. And if we say no, Walter's face darkened. Then you leave. The words sent a chill through the crowd. Some people gasped. Others exchanged nervous glances. Walter let the weight of his words settle. Then his voice softened. I don't want to see anyone lose their home, he said. But I won't apologize for making sure people like Gerald Whitmore never control this land again. A long silence followed. Then a voice spoke up. I'll buy my land. Heads turned. It was Linda Evans, the retired teacher. A few seconds later, someone else stepped forward. Me too. And then another. One by one, people started to agree. Tom clenched his fists, realizing something terrible. Walter wasn't forcing them. He was convincing them. And worst of all, it was working. Across town, Gerald watched the entire meeting on his phone. A neighbor had live-streamed it. And as he watched Walter win over the crowd, his blood boiled. Raymond Holt, his lawyer, sat across from him. This isn't over, Gerald growled. Walter still has enemies. We just have to push them harder. Raymond smirked. I have a plan for that. He slid a document across the table. Gerald picked it up, and his eyes widened. A new lawsuit. A class action lawsuit. Walter had beaten the HOA. He had beaten the town. But now, Raymond was turning the homeowners against him. And this time, Walter might not be able to win. Walter sat at his kitchen table, sipping coffee, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on him. He had spent years orchestrating his perfect plan, outmaneuvering the HOA, trapping Gerald Whitmore, and freeing the homeowners from their nightmare. But now, the battle wasn't over. Because Gerald had just fired his biggest shot yet. And Walter wasn't sure if he could dodge this one. The class action lawsuit landed like a bombshell. Filed by Raymond Holt on behalf of a group of homeowners, the suit accused Walter of unfair business practices, deceptive land ownership tactics, coercion, and undue pressure on residents. In simple terms, they were claiming that Walter had tricked them, that his entire plan was a scheme to take control of their homes and force them into paying rent. The lawsuit demanded millions in damages. And worst of all, it was gaining traction. The news picked it up instantly. Local man faces legal battle after trapping homeowners under his control. Hero or villain? Walter Grayson accused of exploiting residents. The story spread like wildfire, and suddenly, Walter wasn't just a local villain. He was national news. Tom Reynolds sat in his living room, staring at the lawsuit papers in his hands. His wife, Sarah, sat across from him. "I don't know if we should be part of this, Tom." Tom exhaled, rubbing his face. "He put us in this position. We have to fight back." Sarah hesitated. "But what if Gerald is just using us?" Tom frowned. He hated Walter's control, but he despised Gerald. And now it was becoming clear this lawsuit wasn't just about justice. It was a weapon Gerald was using to take back his power. Walter knew the lawsuit was dangerous. It wasn't just a legal attack. It was a public war. If he lost, he wouldn't just lose the land. He'd lose everything. The people, his reputation, his plan. And the worst part? It didn't matter that he had been fair. It didn't matter that he had given the homeowners options. All that mattered was how it looked. And right now, it looked bad. Gerald celebrated, sitting in his new office, an expensive downtown suite he had rented using old HOA money. He poured himself a drink. He had tried to crush Walter before and failed. But this was checkmate. He turned to Raymond. "How long until this buries him?" Raymond smirked. "A few months at best. Once the courts get involved, Walter's going to drown in legal fees. Even if he fights it, he'll be stuck in lawsuits for years." Gerald grinned. Walter had set a trap for him. Now, Gerald had set one for Walter. But Walter wasn't done yet. He sat in his office, staring at the lawsuit papers. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. A few hours later, a black car pulled up in front of his house. A man stepped out. Tall, sharp suit, ice-cold eyes. His name was Victor Langley, and he was the most ruthless defense attorney in the state. Walter didn't greet him. He just handed over the lawsuit papers. Victor skimmed through them, then smirked. "This is cute," he said. "They think they have you cornered." Walter folded his arms. "Can you make this go away?" Victor's smirk widened. "Oh, Walter." He looked up. "I'm not just going to make it go away." He tapped the papers. "I'm going to burn Gerald Whitmore to the ground." The next day, Walter filed his own lawsuit. A counterattack. He wasn't just fighting the class action suit. He was suing Gerald directly. For defamation, for spreading false claims to the media. Fraud, for manipulating homeowners into joining his case. Financial misconduct, for using old HOA money to fund the lawsuit. By noon, the news flipped. Walter wasn't just defending himself anymore. Now, he was going after Gerald. And suddenly, Gerald wasn't so confident anymore. Tom stared at his phone, reading the headlines. Walter fights back, sues former HOA president in shocking counterattack. Sarah looked over his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" Tom didn't answer, because for the first time, he wasn't sure whose side he was on anymore. Gerald slammed his hands on his desk, furious. "That son of a—" Raymond cut him off. "Calm down." "Calm down? He just turned this around on me." Raymond leaned back, tapping his pen on the desk. "We expected this. Walter's smart, but we still have the class action suit. And if we win that, it won't matter what he does to you." Gerald clenched his jaw. Walter was winning battles, but the war wasn't over yet, and Gerald had one more card left to play. That night, Walter was reviewing legal documents when his phone buzzed. "Unknown number. You're not as untouchable as you think." Walter frowned. Who the hell? Another message. A picture of his house, taken from outside. Walter's blood ran cold, because for the first time in this entire battle, it wasn't just about lawsuits anymore. Now it was personal. Walter stared at the photo on his phone. His house, taken from outside. Someone had been watching him. His grip tightened on the phone, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. This wasn't just a legal fight anymore. Gerald had just crossed the line. Walter took a deep breath. Then, without hesitation, he dialed a number. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Yeah." Walter didn't waste time. "Find out who took that picture," he said, "and find out what else they know." The man on the other end chuckled. Consider it done. Walter hung up. If Gerald thought intimidation would scare him, he was dead wrong. Now, this wasn't just about the lawsuit. This was about ending Gerald Whitmore for good. Meanwhile, Gerald sat in his office, swirling a glass of whiskey. Across from him, a man in a leather jacket sat, arms crossed. His name was Mitch Kerrigan, a private investigator and a dirty one. "I got the pictures," Mitch said. "Sent one to Walter, just to rattle him." Gerald grinned. "Good. Let him sweat a little." Mitch smirked. "You sure about this?" "Playing dirty." Gerald downed his whiskey. "Walter ruined me. This is just payback." Mitch leaned back. "You know, guys like Walter, they don't scare easy." Gerald's smile widened. "They do when you hit them where it hurts." The next morning, Walter received another message. This time, it wasn't a picture. It was a recording. He pressed play. Gerald's voice crackled through the speaker. "Walter ruined me. This is just payback." Walter smiled. Whoever Gerald had hired to intimidate him had just made a mistake. Because Walter had caught them. And now, Walter wasn't just playing defense anymore. He was about to go on the attack. That afternoon, Walter went to war. His lawyer, Victor Langley, walked into the courtroom with pure confidence. Across from them, Gerald sat with Raymond Holt, his smug expression barely hiding his nerves. The courtroom buzzed with reporters, cameras flashing. This was no longer just a legal case. This was a spectacle. The judge banged the gavel. "Let's begin." Raymond stood first. "Your Honor, this case is about a man who tricked an entire neighborhood, who took advantage of families and manipulated them into an unfair deal." The judge nodded. "And your response, Mr. Langley?" Victor stood smoothly. "Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt by a man who lost power, nothing more. And we have proof that this lawsuit is built on lies." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Proof?" Victor pulled out his phone. "Press play." Gerald's voice echoed through the silent courtroom. "Walter ruined me. This is just payback." Gasps filled the room. Gerald's face turned ghost white. Raymond Holt's jaw tightened. "That could be doctored." Victor smirked. "It isn't." He turned to Gerald. "Would you like to explain yourself?" Gerald stammered. The judge cut him off. "Enough." She sighed. "This changes things." Walter leaned back, watching Gerald crumble. But it wasn't over yet, because Walter had one more move left to play. That night, Tom Reynolds sat at his dining table, the lawsuit papers in front of him. He had joined the case against Walter because he didn't trust him. But after seeing what Gerald had done, after hearing that recording, he realized something sickening. Gerald had never cared about justice. He had used them, and now Tom was done. The next morning, he walked into the lawyer's office and dropped out of the lawsuit. One by one, others followed. By noon, more than half the plaintiffs had withdrawn. The lawsuit was falling apart. And Gerald? Gerald was finished. 3 days later, the judge made her decision. Case dismissed. Walter had won. Again. Gerald sat alone in his office, staring at the walls. Everything was gone. His reputation, his power, his last chance at revenge. And then, his office door opened. A tall man in a suit stepped inside. His face was unreadable. Gerald swallowed hard. "What do you want?" The man closed the door. "You owe people a lot of money, Gerald." Gerald's breath hitched, because for the first time, he realized something terrifying. He hadn't just lost. He was in real danger. Meanwhile, Walter stood outside, watching the sunset over Willow Creek. The battle was over. The neighborhood was his. And now, it was time to decide what kind of king he wanted to be. Gerald Whitmore's hands trembled as he clutched the edge of his desk. The man standing in front of him wasn't from the courts. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a reporter. He was something much worse. "I don't know what you're talking about," Gerald said, forcing his voice to stay steady. The man, Mark Del Vecchio, just smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "You took money from the wrong people, Gerald," Mark said, stepping closer. "Big money. Investors who were banking on that neighborhood staying under HOA control. People who expected to be repaid." Gerald's stomach twisted. He had borrowed a lot of money to fight Walter. Money he was supposed to win back once he destroyed Walter and reclaimed power over Willow Creek. But he had lost. Now, the people who had funded his war wanted their money back. "Listen, I just need time," Gerald stammered. "I can get the money." Mark cut him off. No, Gerald. You can't. A chill ran through Gerald's spine. He had spent years making other people feel powerless. Now, he was the one backed into a corner. And Mark Del Vecchio? Mark was the kind of man who didn't ask twice. Meanwhile, in Willow Creek, Walter was dealing with his own problems. The lawsuit was dead. The HOA was gone. Gerald was out of the picture. But the neighborhood? It was still divided. Some people had bought their land. Others had reluctantly started renting. But the tension between those who trusted Walter and those who still resented him had only grown. And at the center of it all was Tom Reynolds. Tom had withdrawn from the lawsuit, but he still wasn't convinced that Walter was the hero everyone wanted him to be. And that's why, when Walter called him to meet, Tom almost said no. But curiosity got the better of him. The meeting took place at Walter's house, just as the sun was setting. Walter sat on his porch, a bottle of whiskey between them. He poured 2 glasses, then slid one across the table to Tom. "I don't drink with people I don't trust," Tom said, eyeing the glass. Walter smirked. "That's fair." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Tom sighed. "Why am I here, Walter?" Walter leaned forward. "Because I want you to run this neighborhood." Tom's eyes narrowed. "What?" Walter took a sip of his whiskey. "I own the land, but I don't want to be some shadow king pulling strings forever. The people here need someone they trust. Someone who isn't me." Tom scoffed. "You really think I'd work for you?" Walter shook his head. "Not for me. For them." Tom frowned, staring at his glass. He had spent months fighting against Walter. But deep down he knew Walter wasn't Gerald. He didn't want to control people. He wanted to win. And now that he had, he was looking for an exit. Tom exhaled. "And if I say no?" Walter shrugged. "Then someone worse than me will take my place." Tom knew Walter was right, but he wasn't ready to say yes. Not yet. That night, Gerald disappeared. His office was empty. His phone was disconnected. No one saw him leave. No one saw where he went. And the people he owed money to, they weren't happy. The next morning, Walter received a package. There was no return address. No sender. Just a small box. He opened it and froze. Inside was a single playing card. The King of Spades. Walter's jaw clenched. He had seen this before. It was a message. A warning. And the people sending it? They weren't Gerald's enemies. They were his. Walter knew what it meant. There was someone bigger than Gerald. Someone who had been pulling strings the whole time. And now, they were coming for him. Walter stared at the King of Spades card in his hands, his grip tightening. It had been years since he had seen one, and he never thought he'd see another. Because the last time he had, people died. Walter exhaled slowly, setting the card down. He wasn't rattled easily. But this was a message from someone powerful, someone dangerous, and he had a pretty good idea who it was. Across town, Gerald Whitmore was missing. No one knew where he had gone. No one had seen him leave. But Walter knew better. Gerald hadn't fled. He had been taken by the same people who had just sent Walter the King of Spades. The same people Gerald had borrowed money from. And now that Gerald was out of the way, they were coming for Walter next. Walter wasted no time. He grabbed his phone, dialed a number, and waited. A voice answered. "I was wondering when you'd call." Walter's jaw tightened. How deep was Gerald in? The man on the other end chuckled. Deep enough that when he lost, he was no longer useful. Walter exhaled. "And now they're looking at me." "That's right." Walter rubbed his temple. "How long do I have?" Silence. Then, not long. Walter ended the call. Time to prepare. Meanwhile, in Willow Creek, the tension between homeowners was reaching its boiling point. Those who had bought their land were settling in. Happy, grateful that Walter had given them a chance. But those who had to rent, they weren't so forgiving. And at the center of it all was Tom Reynolds. Tom had spent weeks fighting Walter, and now Walter had given him a chance to run the neighborhood, to be the voice of the people. And Tom still didn't know if he could trust him. That's why, when his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, he almost ignored it, until he read the words. "Walter Grayson isn't the real threat. You're fighting the wrong war." Tom frowned. His fingers hovered over the screen. Then another message. "Meet me. Midnight. Elm Street. Come alone." Tom's heart pounded. Something wasn't right. That night, Walter wasn't home. He was preparing. He had dealt with lawsuits, HOA board members, furious homeowners. But now, he was dealing with something else entirely. Something from his past. And when the people behind the King of Spades came knocking, Walter knew he had to be ready. Because this time, the game was different. This wasn't about winning a legal battle. This wasn't about beating Gerald. This was about survival. Across town, Tom Reynolds arrived at Elm Street. The street was quiet. No cars. No lights. Tom's pulse was steady, but he was on edge. And then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Tom froze, because the person standing in front of him wasn't a stranger. It was Gerald Whitmore, and he looked like hell. Gerald's suit was torn, his face bruised. He had been through something. Tom's stomach twisted. "What the hell happened to you?" Gerald's voice was hoarse. "I made a mistake, Tom." Tom's instinct screamed at him to walk away. But then Gerald said something that made his blood run cold. "Walter isn't your enemy." Tom stared. "What?" Gerald swallowed hard. "I thought he was." "I really did." He looked over his shoulder, as if someone was watching. "But the people I borrowed money from, the people who back me, they aren't just investors." Tom took a slow step forward. "Who are they?" Gerald's voice dropped to a whisper. "The Syndicate." Tom's stomach dropped, because he knew that name. Everyone in town did. The Syndicate wasn't just some loan shark operation. They were organized, ruthless, deadly, and now they had turned their attention to Walter Grayson. Walter stood in his study, staring at the King of Spades card, waiting, listening, and then, a noise outside. Walter didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, grabbing the gun hidden in his desk. Because if the Syndicate was here, they weren't coming to talk. Tom clenched his fists. "If the Syndicate backed you, then why are you still alive?" Gerald swallowed. "Because I promised them something." Tom's skin crawled. "What?" Gerald's eyes were full of regret. "I told them I could still be useful." Tom's breath caught. "Gerald, what did you do?" Gerald's voice broke. "I gave him Walter." Walter heard the footsteps before he saw them. Soft, calculated, the kind of footsteps belonging to people who knew how to move in the dark. People who had done this before. Walter didn't panic. He had expected them. He tightened his grip on the gun in his hand and waited. And when the door creaked open, Walter fired. Across town, Tom Reynolds staggered back as Gerald's words sank in. "I gave him Walter." Tom's pulse pounded. "Gerald, tell me you're lying." Gerald ran a shaking hand through his disheveled hair. "I didn't have a choice. They were going to." Tom lunged at him, grabbing him by the collar. "You bastard." Tom roared. "You sold them out to the Syndicate? They don't leave loose ends, Gerald. They don't just take people to court. They bury them." Gerald gasped for breath. I thought they'd just scare him into selling the land. I didn't know they were sending, Boom. A gunshot echoed through the night. Tom froze. The sound had come from Walter's house. Walter stood over the body. The first man had made the mistake of thinking Walter would hesitate. Now, he was bleeding out on Walter's floor. The others? Still outside, waiting. Walter exhaled, his pulse calm as he knelt and picked up the dead man's gun. Then, he moved toward the door. Because if the Syndicate wanted a fight, Walter was about to give them one. Tom sprinted toward Walter's house, heart racing. He didn't know what he was about to find, but he knew one thing. Walter Grayson was outnumbered, and if Tom didn't get there fast, Walter was going to die. Walter saw the second man before the second man saw him. A rookie, a Syndicate errand boy. Walter moved before he could react, grabbing him from behind, slamming his head against the wall. The man collapsed. Walter stepped over him, unshaken. He wasn't fighting for money. He wasn't fighting for land. This was survival, and Walter had survived worse. But then, a shadow moved. Too late. A sharp pain exploded in Walter's side. He looked down, the blade buried deep in his ribs. He gritted his teeth, didn't scream, didn't go down. He just turned and put a bullet through his attacker's skull. Tom burst into the house just in time to see the third man drop. And in the middle of the room, Walter staggered. Blood soaked his side. Tom's breath caught. Walter caught himself on the table. "Took you long enough." Tom rushed forward, grabbing him. "You're bleeding." Walter's lips curled into a weak smirk. "Not my first knife wound." Tom ignored that. Who else is here? Walter grunted. More coming. He tilted his head toward the gun on the floor. Tom hesitated. He had never fired a gun before. But tonight, that was going to change. Outside, more syndicate men arrived. They didn't run. They didn't panic. They moved like professionals. Because that's what they were. One of them, a tall man in a dark coat, pulled out his phone. A voice answered. Is it done? The man in the coat watched the house. Not yet. The voice on the phone sighed. Then finish it. Inside, Walter tore a piece of his shirt, pressing it to his wound. Tom, he said. Tom turned, gripping the gun so tight his knuckles went white. Walter met his eyes. You want to be a leader? Walter asked, voice low. Then lead. Tom's jaw clenched. Then he turned toward the door and waited, because when the next syndicate man came through that door, Tom Reynolds was going to pull the trigger. The next 10 minutes were a blur of chaos. The syndicate came hard, but Walter and Tom fought harder. Bullets ripped through the air. Bodies hit the floor. And when the dust settled, Walter and Tom were still standing. Barely. Walter pressed a blood-soaked hand against his ribs. Hell of a night. Tom exhaled shakily, lowering the gun. You're insane. Walter grinned. And yet, I'm still alive. Then his face hardened, because he knew this wasn't over. The syndicate didn't stop, not unless someone made them. And Walter knew what had to be done. Across town, Gerald Whitmore sat in a dark motel room, waiting for news. His hands shaking, because if Walter was still alive, that meant Gerald was next. And when a knock came at his door, his breath caught in his throat. He slowly reached for the handle, pulled it open, and when he saw who was standing there, his blood ran cold. Gerald Whitmore's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't Walter. It wasn't a lawyer. It was Mark Del Vecchio, the man who had warned him, the man who had told him he owed too much. And behind Mark, two other men who didn't come to talk. Gerald's mouth went dry. Oh, look, I can fix this. Mark sighed. You had a chance, Gerald. The two men stepped inside. Gerald tried to run, but he didn't make it. Across town, Walter sat on his porch, pressing an ice pack to his ribs. He was alive. Barely. Tom sat next to him, staring out at the quiet night. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Tom exhaled. So what now? Walter leaned back in his chair. That depends. On what? Walter's expression turned serious. On whether or not you're ready. Tom frowned. Ready for what? Walter looked at him. To run this neighborhood. Tom's eyes widened slightly. You're really stepping back? Walter nodded. I didn't do all this just to become another Gerald. The people need someone they trust. Someone who fought for them. Tom hesitated. And what happens to you? Walter smirked. I'm going to disappear for a while. Tom scoffed. And let the syndicate come after you again. Walter's smirk widened. They won't. Tom narrowed his eyes. Why not? Walter tossed him a burner phone. Tom caught it, confused. What's this? Walter's smirk faded. A video. Tom's stomach turned. He knew what that meant. He unlocked the phone. Press play. And his face paled. Because the screen showed Gerald Whitmore, tied to a chair, terrified, begging. Then, the screen cut to black. Tom swallowed hard. Jesus. Walter leaned forward, his voice low. The syndicate doesn't have a reason to chase me anymore. Tom clenched his jaw. You gave him Gerald. Walter shrugged. He was the one who made deals with them. Not me. Tom's stomach churned. So that's it? He just disappears. Walter looked at him. You know how this works. Tom exhaled. And you're okay with that? Walter didn't answer, because he didn't need to. Gerald had made his choice. And now he was paying for it. By morning, the news broke. Gerald Whitmore was missing. No trace. No leads. It was like he had been wiped off the map. The homeowners whispered about it. Some were relieved. Others were uneasy. But no one mourned him. And Willow Creek, for the first time in years, it was finally free. Tom stood at the edge of the neighborhood, watching as Walter's car disappeared down the road. Walter was leaving. And Tom? Tom was staying. Walter had set the trap. He had played the long game. And in the end, he had won. But Tom knew the truth. Walter wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain either. Walter was something far more dangerous. A man who always came out on top. And now, Willow Creek belonged to its people. No HOA. No landlords. Just them. And as Tom looked over his neighborhood, he knew they were going to be just fine, because this time they were in control.